Hi guys, this week we talked about global wildlife conservation. We started out by discussing why wildlife is important. We turned to the problem structure of global wildlife conservation. We discussed the sixth extinction that's emergent and the drivers of extinction. And then we turned our attention to the different institutional processes to support global wildlife conservation before spending more time on the CITES regime. We talked about an article that discussed how the CITES decision-making process privileges reason over commercial or interest-based arguments. And then we talked about solutions to how the global wildlife crisis and conservation could be handled better going forward. We started out by discussing why human beings care about wildlife. They may have intrinsic value as biodiverse species. We may rely upon wildlife species for essential services to support human well-being. There are emotional attachments that human beings place on wildlife, particularly for charismatic megafauna. And there are other uses of wild flora and fauna, for example, for essential medicines. So there are a variety of reasons why human beings may ascribe value to wildlife. Like the challenge for fisheries, we might think of wildlife conservation as having characteristics of commons, where you have limited number of wildlife, but there are difficulties in excluding actors from having access to those habitats where they reside. There are ways in which some of the collective action problems associated with wildlife may dissipate if they're privately owned, such as rhino on ranches, but it's not always clear that even private owners will manage their populations of wildlife with conservation in mind. There may be other pressures that undermine their ability to do so. We can also think about healthy ecosystems supporting wildlife as having elements of being public goods that are non-rivalrous and non-excludable benefits. There are also challenges of different valuations of wildlife between different societal actors that pose challenges for some that are conservation-minded, others that want to exploit them for commercial benefit. And then there are capacity problems both in range states where wildlife emanate from and demand states that may be different far away that may have difficulties in curbing demand for wildlife. So you may have difficulties of state capacity in restricting poaching and other drivers of extinction risks. At the same time, they have difficulties in demand states that may not be the same states in monitoring and interdiction of wildlife products and diminishing overall demand. We talked about the sixth extinction, which is an idea introduced to us by the journalist Elizabeth Kolbert in her book of the same name. And it gets at the risk of this being the sixth mass extinction event for species on planet Earth, with 5 previous mass extinction events largely occurring after major climatic changes. The previous mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous, some 145 million years ago, occurred when an asteroid hit the Yucatan and caused the dinosaurs to go extinct. But the difference this time is that human beings may be increasing the background rate of extinction far beyond what baseline levels that would be expected. And so Hannah Ritchie in her book interrogates what constitutes a mass extinction event, and the risk is that some 75% of the world's species could go extinct in a relatively short amount of time. But a relatively short amount of time is on geologic time that, say, over a course of 2 million years that might occur. Her concern is that at present rates of extinction, we might see some 3/4 of species on planet Earth go extinct in the next 37,500 years, which is too long for any of us to really get our heads around, but gets at this speed with which human beings are causing life on the planet to potentially go extinct at higher rates than before. So there are some 44,000 species that are at risk of extinction, many of them plant species, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature documents this extinction risk in its annual red list and has done so for decades. And that gets at this heightened risk of extinction that we're observing and tracking with lists like these. So there are a number of different drivers of extinction. Poaching and overharvesting are among them. There are others, loss of habitat through conversion of habitat to agricultural land, to urban lands. There are also other drivers, such as pollutants that are causing species decline. There's the phenomenon of climate change itself, which is threatening the survivability of coral reefs and causing habitat change for both aquatic and non-aquatic species alike. There are risks documented in books like The Sixth Extinction on disease risks. So the chytrid fungus that is affecting amphibians is one that was discussed in that book. So there are a variety of drivers of extinction, and human beings are accentuating those risks through our activity. Ritchie draws particular attention to the links between agriculture and habitat loss and the loss of species, and suggests that this is a really important area to think about, given that if there's more intensive and efficient use of agriculture, that will take pressure off wild species. And she documents in her book how many of the large mammal species have been replaced not only with agricultural lands, but with lands for livestock. There are a variety of efforts to address wildlife and wildlife conservation. Foremost among them is the CITES treaty dating back to the early 1970s, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, about which I'll say more. There are other efforts like the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which has a bearing on species that reside in wetlands, and also UNESCO World Heritage Sites that also speak to some natural and cultural areas, but the natural areas are maybe more relevant for identifying places of biological richness. Of course, there are the variety of fisheries management organizations that we discussed in previous weeks, but these are the primary institutions that are designed and derived to address wildlife conservation. There are, of course, national laws in different country contexts that also regulate protection of species, like the Endangered Species Act in the US. There are comparable laws at the regional and national level in other polities like the European Union as well. The CITES regime or treaty, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, dates back to the early 1970s and is an effort to regulate the trade in endangered species. And it consists of a variety of lists of different species that have different tiers, and so-called Appendix 1 lists of species have the highest protection, which essentially bans the commercial trade in those species that are on that list. Then there are Appendix 2 species, which regulates the trade, that there are species that are at higher risk of extinction, but not the highest risk, which it regulates the trade. And then there's an Appendix 3, which is basically a country identifies that a species in its territory is at risk and it may need some help of conservation. One thing that's important about these different lists is that they're not necessarily blanket lists for a species across all geographies, that you could have some subpopulations on Appendix 1 lists and other subpopulations on Appendix 2, for example. And so that is a more complex mechanism for regulating the trade in endangered species. So the mechanics of listing species on these appendices depends upon the periodic meetings of the Conference of Parties, which generally occur once every 2 to 3 years. And it requires a 2/3 vote of delegates at the Conference of Parties. And other states are bound by the 2/3 vote and the decisions, even if they didn't vote for them, subject to their ability to exercise some reservations. So this is an important procedural element that undergirds the CITES regime. So if a species ends up on Appendix 1, it essentially bans the commercial trade in those species, although it still may allow for the scientific transfer of species between countries, which would require both an export permit by the country of origin and an import permit by the recipient countries. And there are species on this list like gorillas, sea turtles, and giant pandas. The Appendix 2 list, which is one step down from the most threatened species, is one that allows for the controlled trade in some species, such as lions, subject to the exporting country issuing a permit. Sometimes the rules for importing countries are such that they'll also require a permit, but that's not part of the CITES regime. And so Appendix 2 lists are another important way to regulate and control the trade in endangered species. And you can see the varieties of protection by fauna in this accompanying chart, which shows that there are a decent number of animals on Appendix 1 lists and a larger number on Appendix 2 lists. And the status of those flora and fauna on different lists can change over time with votes by delegation, so they can upgrade the status or downgrade as populations as they recover. And an important facet of this sort of list process is that over time there's been increased use of CITES as a regime for aquatic species in particular. So in recent decades, sharks and rays and other aquatic species have been increasingly listed by CITES for protection, and that's a relatively new development. The CITES regime is seen as relatively successful in regulating the trade of endangered species, but it has some limitations. It doesn't apply to domestic conservation efforts. It only regulates the international trade in species. And so if populations aren't protected domestically, there's not a lot that CITES can do about it. At the same time, there have been some credibility challenges for CITES in that the delegates have voted on a couple of occasions in the late 90s and mid 2000s for one-off sales of ivory, which facilitated declines in elephant populations as demand grew in places like Japan at first and then later China. And so that's posed challenges for the CITES regime, but generally people think that this mechanism works. It doesn't ban the trade in endangered species, but it largely regulates it with more vigorous and rigorous controls for those species that end up on Appendix 1 lists, and that there are other sort of complementary enforcement measures that can help increase the credibility of CITES rulemaking. So, for example, if a country is deemed not to have sufficient monitoring and regulatory standards in place, then the CITES Conference of the Parties can decide to basically ban the trade in species of all species to and from a particular country, or limit it to particular species, like an orchid species, for example. And that mechanism is typically obeyed. There are ways in which states and actors inside them can go around those rules illegally, but most of the time, and the major importing and exporting states typically obey those rules. So countries like the United States and China will not issue permits to or for species that end up, say, on the Appendix 1 list. And so CITES is again seen as an important element in addressing the trade in endangered species. It doesn't address other threats to wildlife, but it certainly helps regulate the trade. One argument that we read about suggests that CITES is relatively effective in limiting, say, self-interested commercial arguments in the rulemaking process for listing species by separating the scientific process for recommending a species be listed, which is handled by the Secretariat, from the political decision by the delegates of whether or not a species merits protection. And that separation between the scientific decision on whether a species is threatened and worthy of protection happens at one level by the Secretariat, and then a second decision by the political actors happens separately. And thereby, the authors suggest that CITES privileges reason over commercial-based arguments. So when a country doesn't want to see a species listed in the decisions to vote by a 2/3 majority that a species is worthy of protection, it typically will make arguments based on the quality of the science, not saying we would like to be able to use this species for commercial gain. Rather, they'll say, we don't think the science is settled here, or they'll appeal to other evidence, like on aquatic species. Sometimes there's contradictory decisions or recommendations from the Food and Agricultural Organization. And so this is how the CITES Secretariat privileges science-based decision-making in its approach to species conservation. We had a limited discussion about the Convention on Biological Diversity, to which the United States isn't a party, but for which there are ambitious plans to enhance its efforts to protect biodiversity around the world. And there are efforts to mobilize large amounts of funds to protect more habitat around the world, the so-called 30 by 30 exercise, which is intended to dedicate 30% of territories by 2030 to protection, both at sea and on land. And those efforts have periodically run into challenges of how to mobilize the funds to support those conservation efforts. And it remains an open question, as far as I understand it, that whether or not those efforts to raise funds will be successful, because it is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And at a moment in history in which foreign assistance funding is harder and harder to come by, it's less clear that these ambitious schemes to mobilize funds to support biodiversity and habitat conservation will be successful, but there are efforts to try to make it so. The last topic we discussed this week, it was Vonda Felbab-Brown's book, The Extinction Market, which sought to identify strategies to enhance conservation of wildlife, particularly from risks from poaching. And her argument is one that suggests there isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy, that conservation efforts will need to be tailored to different country approaches. But there are some principles that she supports in that the instrumental use of wildlife may be necessary under certain circumstances to generate community buy-in by communities that are proximate to wildlife populations. And so the use of wildlife for sport hunting, for example, or other even extraction for sale in international markets for the pet trade or international trade may be necessary under some circumstances, to the extent that it generates revenue for communities that would have more of a vested interest in the survival of the species if that requires the sacrifice of some individual representatives of that species. And so there may be a preference for less heavy use of those wildlife species through tourism, which may have some bearing on wildlife species, but not require their extraction. But those efforts to build community buy-in require revenue sharing with those local communities so that they are the main beneficiaries of wildlife conservation. You still may want to tax those wildlife resources, based resources that are generated, but you want to do so in a way in which the communities that are closest to the wildlife benefit from it. Otherwise, they may support poaching, they may not inform on illegal actors who are trying to extract wildlife. They may find that wildlife are destroying their crops or endangering community populations and become less supportive of wildlife conservation writ large. So that's a key principle that emerges from Felbab-Brown's thinking, but she also noted that in the mid-2010s that the crisis of ivory, elephant ivory and rhino horn extraction derived from the rising demand from Asia required severe restrictions and bans of the international trade from the affected areas, primarily from the African continent to Asia, that international trade had to be restricted until such time that populations could recover. Meanwhile, there needed to be heavy emphasis on demand reduction in Asia so that populations in that part of the world could be made aware that demand for ivory and rhino was contributing to species declines and declines for other species as well that were at risk, such as pangolin. So these were among the insights that were derived from her book, and how the specific ways in which wildlife conservation could be enhanced needed to be tailored to particular circumstances of different places. So as we think about what should be done going forward, there's the problem of range states with limited state capacity that have trouble stopping actors from accessing and killing wildlife and extracting wildlife. And then there are problems in demand states that have difficulty monitoring and enforcing rules and restricting demand for wildlife, both in terms of persuading publics not to seek endangered species for instrumental use, such as for medicinal purposes or for display or for status or for artistic purposes, that these demand states have trouble both persuading their publics not to seek these products, but also they have difficulty interdicting, monitoring, and enforcing rules that punish people for law breaking. And so there are two capacity problems that need to be dealt with to more effectively prevent extinction risks from poaching, and that has to do with both the range states need to be able to control their territories better, and also demand states need to prevent the illegal entry of wildlife products and also persuade their publics to reduce their demand. There are other threats to wildlife that addressing these capacity constraints can't really resolve, such as the challenges of enhanced disease risk like we see with amphibians, or the challenges to species such as from climate change. And there may be more tailored specific ways in which those threats to wildlife have to be addressed. And of course, there's the bigger question of loss of habitat for conversion to agriculture or to commercial forests or to livestock. And so Hannah Ritchie is really big on more efficient use of land for food growing, which would take the pressure off habitats to allow for wildlife to flourish. And so these diverse efforts through the Convention on Biological Diversity or the BBNJ to set aside both terrestrial and marine protected areas may be important elements, if they can be successful, to take some pressure off wildlife, to have some lands that are more set aside for their core habitats to recover. And we'll have to see if those efforts are successful going forward.